Well, good evening and welcome back. It's been a couple of weeks since I've actually been up here for a Sunday evening. If you remember, we had Fifth Sunday Exchange. We had our guest speaker from Northwest last week, and that was his first ever outing outside of Northwest, and I was glad that you were able to make him feel welcomed. And then the week before that, we had Mr. Markham's a report from Ecuador. So it's actually been a couple of Sunday nights that I've been with you. And the reason I bring that up is that over the past several weeks prior to those two leading up, I have been giving you a couple of songs that we read that was actually written by David, found in the Psalms that I shared with you. And I told you how much I appreciated his ability to speak to us through words. I told you how I appreciate his words so much and why so many turn to his words during time of struggle, during time of grief. Very articulate. I'm not a writer. I don't have those skills. I sure wish that I could. His expression of just love towards God alone, how he can express what he's feeling. And I think that's why we say that, even times of grief and funerals, you'll hear a psalm read. You'll hear David's words. He is able, through his imagery, to paint a picture in your mind that words can do. And that's a great talent if you are able to do that. If someone can bring those images out. Sometimes you say, I really don't know how to describe this. And someone may, just perfectly sit down and set that up. That's why I have liked radio so much and calling football games. I try to paint the picture for people who can't make the game in person. That's why it still exists today as a medium. Maybe they can follow along with what's going on in their mind without actually being there in person. And so afterwards, when you get someone to say to you later, it was like I was there. It really is the ultimate compliment for someone like myself trying to do that. So what I try to do with the voice can also be done with expression of words. I can't as much in that department, and I guess maybe that's why I envy it so much. I'm so far from that, being able to articulate that way. So tonight I found another very talented man that had that gift much as David did. His name is not remembered very often, not mentioned too much, or remembered in sermons. I really don't even remember hearing much about him before. His name is Elihu. It's one of Job's friend. And when I say one of Job's friends, he is a better friend, because if you remember, in contrast, he had a lot of counsel around him. One was his wife, who told him to just curse God and die. And then there was other friends that were having him to try to say, you need to own up to this. You need to tell us what your sins are, because this calamity is happening because. And so that's kind of what he was hearing. He had those influences, as we know. And he rebukes them over in Job 32. And then addresses Job after he appeals to God that he gave back in chapter 31. And before God replies to Job, if you read Job, and it's kind of a back and forth, it's Job asks and God replies, and it kind of goes back and forth in this dialogue. Before we get to God's reply in Job 38, I want us to look at the one chapter that he gives us in great description and kind of look at that together. This is found in Job 37. So if you will, and if you have a Bible, if you'll turn to Job chapter 37, and if you don't have one, there's probably one in the pew that you can borrow and take a look at there. I would also add, after reading this, I would love to have a friend like this, encourager, an encourager of great words. I can't tell you that my wife and I have been impressed with some of the cards that we receive from you from time to time. Encouraging words. I hear it from the pulpit. I hear it in prayers. That goes so much for anybody that's done preaching for any length of time. I'm sure Weldon will attest to that as well, to get that kind of encouragement. Today, we find him writing these kind of people with talents. Where do we find them? Well, writing greeting cards or maybe great speeches. It's amazing now that our politicians have gotten away from trying to articulate and express their own. Even presidents of the United States, as far back as, if you go up to Lincoln, where Lincoln wrote his own, but even Ronald Reagan, they had speech writers. They had people to be able to get the thoughts down on paper. Again, a very, very unique talent. Today I want to look at this section in Job where he talks to Job and gives him a special counsel. And first and foremost, where he wants Job to see God's majesty. Sometimes we don't stop and really admire God's majesty. Starting in verse 1, the title of this chapter says, Proclaiming God's Majesty. That was on the highlight on the top of my Bible because God is so big. He is so wonderful. He is so majestic. But oftentimes, since our great connection to Jesus, in the New Testament, as man and God, we see God as our friend. We see songs about God being our friend, our companion, someone to talk to, someone to reach out and feel our compassion, someone to touch, reach out to. And he wants us to. And he is. But he also is a God that's due all the reverence that I can give him, which you can give him. And why we are to, as I mentioned out this morning, on our own accord, to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. He starts out, At this also my heart trembles and leaps out of its place. You know, he starts out with a great imagery to say his heart, your heart, our heart trembles and should and leap out of its place. Why? Well, if we were to take on God's majesty and take in all of what God is, and I know that's very limited for us because we struggle with that concept because we're only human. But in your life, have you ever had your breath taken away with something? Ever had your heart skip a beat? Now, that phrase is used often when you fall in love. Your heart raced. It skipped a beat when you met that person. It may have been love at first sight. So that's just a feeling that you get, and it's kind of one of those things and one of those captured moments that you may relish. Or maybe it's something grand. You've seen something that's just so breathtaking, takes your breath away. And that's a good place for us to start when we think about God. It's a good descriptive to start out with. And with verse 2, keep listening to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it go, and his lightning to the corners of the earth. Now, I know we all wish to hear God's voice, and we do today in his Son and his words to us. But I'm actually talking audibly. How grand would that be? I know there's a few people in Old Testament times that got to hear that voice, even in New Testament, with Paul hearing that voice. And the only thing that John could put in his writings in the Revelation is like thunder. I mean, to have that echoing across, the thunder of his voice. And then when he lets it go, it's all throughout heaven. And his lightning, which we see to the corners of the earth. See his sovereignty again. Our God is in control over everything. He has not just wound it all up, so to speak, and let it go and to see what happens. As there was many in our forefathers of this nation believe that that's who God was. A faraway God. Just wind it up and set it in motion and sit back and let it all play out. Verse 4, after it his voice roars, the thunder with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightnings when his voice is heard. God thunders wondrously with his voice. He does great things that we cannot comprehend. Now, if you have been coming last quarter during Sunday morning class, I appreciate Weldon's little tidbit that he gives us. And in fact, I always like to try to hit him up for something else that he's found revealing in space. To be able to, he says, the reason he did that before class had nothing to do with the class stuff is to expand our minds, to see the appreciation of God and all of what he's done, and all of God in the universe, trying to expand our minds so we can have a broader appreciation for what God is and who he is. And I am fully willing to accept that he does great things, that what this says here, that we cannot comprehend. I know a lot of times there are ministers that feel like, and I've appreciated when people have classes and say, I really don't know all the answers to this. I really have not put it all together. I can't take it all in. I mean, God has already said your ways are not my ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. I don't want to try to contain, to probably put God in a box, so to speak, and you've heard that image before. When we do that, we contain and limit what God is able and not able to do. And that goes with this verse. It says that he does great things that we cannot comprehend. We may not understand all the intricate details out. And I know we have wonderful scientists that try to explain why. Try to explain every little intricate detail. And here he writes that there are just some things that he does that are so grand and so great that you can't comprehend it. My mind can't take it in. Or we may strive to, try to understand, but barely take in a fraction, I suppose. So he talked about, I didn't even really realize this until you start putting it into understanding about why we measure space in light years. And the only reason why is because mileage would make no sense to us, because the numbers would be off the scale. Because in order to get the amount of space that we're talking about, it would be a number that we couldn't pronounce, and it would make no sense to you. But in light years, we can kind of contain that as it goes 6 times around the earth in 1 second, and we're trying to put that in miles. Just let that sink in for a second. You really can't. I mean, we don't even know how far that is. I know how far it is to get to Michigan, but when our trip, and about a 19-hour drive and about 1,200 miles, and it may take all day of driving to get there. I can understand that. I can't understand going around the world. I've never done that, let alone 6 times within 1 second. So you get the idea of how that expands and how that goes beyond what we are trying to contain. It's above me. Not only literally in space, it really is above me in comprehension. He goes on with things that we see during the season and changing of the seasons, and why we should see God, and why in the end there will be no excuse. Verse 6 says, "For to the snow," he says, "fall on the earth, likewise to the downpour, his mighty downpour." It wasn't until I moved here to southwest Oklahoma to understand what a true downpour is, where we call it a gully washer. We talk about where it rains so hard and so much in a downpour, you can't see the other side of the street. Now in Michigan, I've never seen rains like that. I've never had a downpour. I've had rains, but not a downpour, where you'd have to pull off to the side of the road because you could no longer drive, where the waters in flash flood in just seconds could sweep cars away. You understand that. We in southwest Oklahoma can understand a downpour, and here basically he says he's commanding it. To the snow, he says, fall on the earth. And likewise to the downpour, his mighty downpour. And that's why we don't really have to fret about our conditions. And I know that we are concerned about drought, and we pray to God for rain and more rain in due time when necessary. If we can get a 3-incher, 3 or 4 inches in an hour, we've seen it. It can happen just like that. It can fill our ponds, not after weeks and months, but just at a moment's notice. We should see God in the changing of the seasons. Why the wrath of God is stored up, as Paul wrote in Romans 1:18, for those who refuse to see it. Now you can keep right there, but I want to show this here in Romans and what he says here. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God and give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. See, don't ever miss the small stuff. Take time, as the old expression is, stop and smell the roses. That's why I appreciate the changing of the seasons. Why? Because I see God's hand in it. I see him there. It's everywhere. And whether it's a beautiful sunrise or a sunset or the ocean, the beaches, to the top of majestic mountains, snow-capped covered mountains, to even as simply as the rain, a snow or a downpour. Any of this, don't forget the small stuff we take for granted. And what Paul addresses, this that we can't ignore it. It's been there ever since. So back to our Job 37 reference in verse 7. He seals up the hand of every man, that all men whom he made may know. Then the beasts go into their lairs and remain in their dens. From its chamber comes the whirlwind and the cold from the scattering winds. By the breath of God, ice is given. Now, what a great image, again, to write about, that by God's breath, ice is given. Have you ever witnessed the beauty of just ice? A lot of us don't like ice. We trip and fall in it. You know, we don't like the freezing rain especially. At this time of the year, we're always on guard to see it. But ice on a frosted snow, for example, you can see the beauty just in looking in that. And I need to have that so, I know it's a nuisance for many of us. When we have ice, we have to thaw. We have to make sure that we put it on defrost so I can leave and then go to work. But just even the simple things. How ice in its cold is a sight to see. A snowflake in its wonder, and to know that not one is the same. Just like mankind. First time you ever heard that in grade school, and they say that, there's not one snowflake alike. And you know how many snowflakes there are in a snowstorm. Just think of that. And he paints these pictures and images within Job for encouragement. What is he telling Job? Job, God is in control. He's seeing everything that's going on. There's nothing that gets by him. Never forget that. And just like a Hallmark card from a guy I never heard of, see, he gets it. I can think of great images that I have seen over the years, and now try to apply that and be thankful to God to witness just his handiwork. And this says, and the broad waters are frozen fast. He says to Job, I have seen broad waters. In my background, I know such as lakes back in Michigan frozen. Frozen so solid and so thick that you can not only walk on them, but drive vehicles and set up ice shanties in the middle of winter. I mean, it's all for the warmth and everything else. It's got door on it. People put generators in there and heaters, and sometimes electricity, so you can have TV and watch all of this stuff while you ice fish. All right there. And you can drive your truck right out there. Now that is something. Little homes on the ice to stay warm in. Verse 11, he loads the thick cloud with moisture. The clouds scatter his lightning. See, the rain that he gives us, he loads the thick cloud with rain, and the clouds scatter his lightning. They turn around and around by his guidance. Notice that. It's not by chance. It's not by accident. Interesting, we see that pressure systems, that's how they define it, with high pressure and low pressures, show that when it gets locked in, and a couple years ago we saw this, and the weatherman had to tell us that it circles back around, as that pressure keeps it right there. But here it says that God makes all this happen, to come back around again and again, and maybe even possibly bring even more rain. If you remember several years ago, we saw that happen. If you remember, we got so much rain in so many days. It just seems like it would never end. It would just circle right back, and what it dumped on, it just came back and dumped on us again. Cache Creek was busting over. I remember the water park was underwater. It was an amazing sight to see that much. And here Job reminds us again, it's not your local weatherman in control of all this, or explaining it through just high and low pressures. How do the pressure systems get there? And all that they do is they try to explain as to why and why we see it. We should already know, by the hand of God. Verse 12 says, they turn around and around by his guidance. He is in control. That's a great God that we serve. Goes on to say, to accomplish all that he commands them on the face of the habitable world. Who's in charge? Do we need to be told again? See, Job needed a little bit of reminder. He wasn't left on that heap of ashes to accomplish all that he commands them on the face of the habitable world. Now listen to this next verse, because I know I have always heard another passage that says it rains on the just and the unjust. That's found in Matthew 5:45. But now notice what this says. He does this according to verse 13, whether for correction or for his land or for love, he causes it to happen. Hear this, O Job, stop and consider the wondrous works of God. I love how he asks Job to stop and consider what he's doing for us right now, for us to get all the imagery that he's saying, for all of us to stop, take time out, to take it in, all in. Stop and smell the roses. Stop and consider the wondrous works of God. And then when you get there, you keep it up. Verse 15, do you know how God lays his command upon them? No, we don't. That dialogue goes into Job later on. Job, were you there when this was created? Were you there on day one? Were you there when I created this animal or this plant? No. And he causes the lightning of his cloud to shine. Do you know the balancing of the clouds? I just know they're up there. It's amazing, in a flat picture for our minds, we just see the clouds and it looks flat. Then you get on an airplane, you see it three-dimensionally. It's great they talked about how many 100 and some odd hours that we've not seen the sun. It's up there. You get on a cloudy day like that and get up in a plane, you get up above there, it's blue skies and sunshine because you're above that cloud line. You know how they stay in balance? No. They just kind of float around there. No, in fact, the next chapter of how God responds goes even beyond that when you have time. But I've flown above those clouds in flight. You take wonder on it. Remember how cloudy and rainy, it could be rainy and overcast, and you can just feel it and just say, this is a cloudy day, and I kind of feel it. Then you get on a plane and go above that, and it's sunshine and blue skies, and you go, wow, I'm ready. Just a whole different attitude with just that difference. And you can be up there and still think that there is no God. There's no wonder the Bible calls them a fool if we can't or won't believe. Only a fool will say that there is no God. And remember, the definition of a fool, according to the Bible, is one that knows better. The wondrous works of him who is in perfect knowledge, verse 16. You whose garments are hot when the earth is still because of the south wind. We know those south winds. We know heat. Shows we don't have much control, does it? Then he asks him, verse 18, can you, like him, spread out the skies? Hard as a cast metal mirror? Teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot draw up our because of darkness. Shall it be told to him that I would speak? That reminds me of a song that talks a little bit about that ability to even speak if we were in the presence of God. I know Paul references that we can go to his throne boldly, and that's because we can go to the Father through Jesus Christ, our advocate. But many of you probably have heard the song, I Can Only Imagine. If you've not, then I want to paint you a little picture with the lyrics of that song, which says, I can only imagine what my eyes will see. When your face is before me, I can only imagine, surrounded by your glory. What will my heart feel? That's what he said in verse 1. Let's skip a beat. What will my heart feel? Will I dance for you, Jesus, or in awe of you be still? Will I stand in your presence, or to my knees will I fall? Will I sing hallelujah? Will I be able to speak at all? I can only imagine when that day comes and I find myself standing in the sun. I can only imagine when all I will do is forever worship you. I can only imagine when all I will do is forever worship you. Would we just shrink away? He says back to our chapter in review, did a man ever wish that he would be swallowed up? And now no one looks on the light when it is bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes golden splendor. God is clothed with awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is great and power, justice, and abundant righteousness he will not violate. Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. I know that this friend was trying to encourage Job to kind of get his thinking off of his problems, of what's going on in his life, kind of showing the intricate details that God is in control over every, what we would say, minuscule thing. But it's not. And that's the God that we serve. A lot of great imagery there and others that we can look to. A lot of times these passages are forgotten, but they're canonized for a reason. They're here for our learning, as the New Testament would say, to go back and to be encouraged. That's why we offer an invitation as well, to be an encouragement to you, that we can pray with you and for you, maybe on something that's going on in your life that you need some extra support with. Or maybe you've never obeyed the gospel and we don't want an opportunity to go unnoticed, to say everything is ready, everything is prepared for this moment, if that is your desire. Whatever your wish is to make known, if it's such, you can come now and make it known as we stand and as we sing. I must tell Jesus.